So today is May 7th, and this represents our fourth class in the book of Hebrews. So let's quickly look at a review of the outline so we can kind of get reminded about the flow of the book. The basic kind of theme of the book is the superiority of Christ to everything. But the reason why he teaches this message about Christ and the superiority of Christ is because there were people who were kind of just getting beaten down from hardship of following Christ, persecutions, and they were starting to walk away from being tempted to walk away. So what the book of Hebrews does is says, you can't do that. Christ is everything. You need to stay faithful to the Lord. So the superiority of Christ is tied with a call to perseverance. Keep going, don't stop. The Lord is faithful. Just keep following the Lord. So in verses 1 to 4, first major section, the superiority of Christ to all of the Old Testament revelation. God has spoken through Christ now. In chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 2, verse 18, it kind of as the entire section deals with the superiority of Christ to angels. And there's a series of kind of explanations of why Christ is superior to the angels. But what happens in the middle of that whole discussion is that he gives the first warning passage, because throughout the book there are a series of about 6 warning passages that says, don't turn away from Christ. Bad things if you turn away from Christ and you're not saved. So the first warning passage is in verses 1 to 4, but then in verses 5 to 18 it resumes with the warnings, or not the warnings, but the superiority of Christ to angels. When you come to chapter 3, it brings Moses into the picture and says, Moses was a great guy, faithful to God, but Christ is greater. So Moses is there in the Old Testament, but Christ is greater. Chapter 4 introduces us to Joshua, and the Bible says Joshua gave the people rest. Well, a certain kind of rest, but it wasn't the end rest that was going to come in the kingdom. And so Jesus is greater because Jesus is the one that gives us eternal rest. That's basically what you get in chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse 14, introduces the superiority of Christ to the Old Testament priesthood and the Old Testament sacrificial system. And that is a huge section that starts in 4:14 and goes all the way to 10:18. So there's a continual source of, discussions about the superiority of Christ and this priesthood. Now, you had that first warning passage in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. There was a second warning passage that came in chapter 3, verses 12 to 19. When you get to chapter 5, verses 11 through 6-8, there's a third warning passage, and that's the one that is, kind of the most challenging one to understand, and makes a lot of people stumble. So we ended with that discussion last week in chapter 6, verse 8, and then he resumes back with Christ's priesthood. So in chapter 6, verse 9 through chapter 7, verse 28, he talks about the effectiveness of his priesthood. His power and his faithfulness as our high priest assures us enduring blessing for those who belong to him. That's going to be 6:9 to 7:28. And then when you come to chapter 8, what's going to happen is that he's going to bring comparisons between the priesthood of Christ and the Old Testament priesthood. And in chapter 8 to 10:18, you have 3 sets of comparisons between the Old Testament priesthood and Christ's priesthood. So coming back here to chapter 6, verse 9. Let's see here. The call to perseverance and the power of Christ's priesthood. So we had that warning passage in verses 1 to 8. And we came to chapter 6, verse 9, where after giving that warning, he says, but we're convinced of better things concerning you, the things that accompany salvation, even though we're speaking this way. So I just gave you a really harsh, strong warning about what happens if a person rejects Christ, but that's not the way I look at you guys. I believe that you guys are saved. But his real kind of fear comes because he knows that there are some people who are showing a willingness to walk away from their confession, their profession of Christ, because of the hardships. So in chapter 6, verse 9 to chapter 7, verse 28, really 2 chapters, it deals with the effectiveness of Christ's priesthood. His power and his faithfulness as our high priest assures enduring blessing for those who belong to him. So it starts off in chapter 6, verses 9 to 12, the idea that confidence comes out of perseverance. For the remainder of this immediate section, we can think about the importance of perseverance. The word perseverance that is used a number of times is hupamane. Mane means to remain, and hupa means under. So hupamane is the idea of remaining under the hardships and staying faithful. There are 3 major exhortations about persevering, and the first one comes in verse 9. Beloved, we are convinced of better things concerning you, concerning the things that concern salvation, even though we are speaking this way. So this is a positive encouragement that he trusts that nobody is going to walk away from Christ and the profession of faith and die in disbelief. So this is really pastoral encouragement. He does the same thing later on in chapter 10. He gives a major warning in chapter 10, verses 26 to 31. But then in the rest of the chapter, he gives them the reminder that they've already shown so much fruit in their past by following Christ and serving Christ in the middle of tribulation and, persecutions. And he says, you guys have really paid a big price for your faith. You've had your confiscations, your possessions confiscated, you've been put in jail, and all these things. So, and I'm really proud of you guys. This is kind of what you have happening right here. It's a pastoral exhortation, to keep going on. We have better, more. We have a positive view of you guys, that you are saved. It's this really illustrates that it's important to encourage people. Yes. It's easy to take and rub somebody's face in the mud. Any stupid person can do that, But God doesn't call us to destroy people, but to build them up. It says in Isaiah 42, a bruised reed he will not break, a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. The Messiah comes to build people up. And that's what this pastor is doing in this encouragement. A second exhortation comes in verse 10, where he reminds them that past fruit is a good indicator of a relationship with God. For God is not unjust so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name, in having ministered and still ministering to the saints. All right, so question. If somebody is not saved and they try to be good to get to heaven, when they die, is God going to say, you know what, you did so many wonderful things. All right, here's how I'm going to bless you with that. No, it's not going to happen. But here, what he's doing is he's reminding them of the way that they have persevered in serving Christ. He says, you guys have, worked for the Lord. You have loved his name. You have loved his people. You've ministered to his people. And you're still ministering to the saints. So there was a great history in these guys' lives that he says, God sees your faithfulness and all these things. For God is not so unjust to forget all of your labors. In verses 11 to 12, here comes a third exhortation to keep persevering. In these verses, the writer comes back to the main point of encouraging them to persevere. So you've done well over the years, and if this letter is written in about 69, that almost everybody would kind of agree with that. That means that this congregation probably came into existence, some 35 years earlier, So a lot can happen in 35 years.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So we desire that each one of you, when you look at this statement here, each one of you, it's got, where are we here? Okay, this uses a little different construction, but we desire that each one of you, every individual, would show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope, firm to the end. Keep on going. Don't stop. No matter what the past and no matter what the present, keep going. But one thing is clear, these guys have been faithful in the past, but you can't rest in the past either, right? You can't live on last year's championship. Now, I do that all the time, though. I think about when UNLV won the NCAA basketball championship in 1990, 36 years ago. Oh, they were great, But you can't do that in your Christian life. Paul said that in Philippians chapter 3. He says, I haven't arrived at some kind of sinless perfection. I don't think that I've become some super pious spiritual guy, but I keep pressing on. So you can't rest in the past. He says, putting aside the things that are behind and pressing forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal. When Paul says that in Philippians 3, he says, I lay aside, I put behind me the things of the past. He's not talking about bad things like when he used to kill Christians before he was saved. He's talking about the fact, because think about Paul writing that in 61. That's 27 years of traveling everywhere, preaching the gospel, starting churches, and getting beat up times without number. I can't even count how many times I've been beaten up, and so he doesn't look at that and say, "Man, I've really arrived." No, keeps going, and this is kind of what he's doing right here with Hebrews. You just have to keep on going. Now, Steve, did you say that you went to Scotland before?
Did what?
Scotland? Did you say that?
No, I haven't been to Scotland. I've been to Ireland.
Okay. But we're
going to go next year.
If you go to St. Giles Chapel, I guess you pronounce it Giles, Giles, it's where John Knox used to preach. I've got a picture of, John Knox's tomb. It's parking spot number 23 in the parking lot. Like, wow.
Is it marked?
There's a little marker. But yeah, I asked the guy inside, hey, where's John Knox buried? He goes, oh, it's parking spot number 23 out back. It's like, wow. Yeah. Everything that you did for the name of Christ and the gospel, and you're in parking
spot 23.
So you know what? Don't expect anything out of this world. God has the reward. So verse 12, he gives them more encouragement. He points to the example of faithful saints of past ages. So keep moving ahead, firm until the end, so that you will not become sluggish, which is the idea of slow. Don't become sluggish, but be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Well, we're going to have an entire chapter on that in chapter 11, right? But the idea is this, don't become lazy and sluggish. Steve, what are you, 70, you said? No? You're 70? Yeah. So, Steve, man, you've been really faithful in, preaching the gospel, That's wonderful.
I am slowing down a little bit, though.
Yeah. So the idea here is this. Keep trusting God, keep following the Lord, keep serving the Lord. So coming down here to verses 13 to 20, this idea of perseverance continues. And here in verses 6:13 to 7:28, he basically introduces the basis for perseverance. So he's been calling them to persevere. Now he's going to introduce a reason for them to persevere. And the reason for them to persevere is because of God's gracious promises through his Son. In the end, the only real source of perseverance and encouragement is God himself. Your eternal security, your perseverance is not something that originates from within you, but it comes from God. Really think about Philippians chapter 1, right? I am convinced of this very thing, that he who began a good work in you will complete it to the day of Christ Jesus. So we don't want to trust in ourselves and our own strength. Otherwise, we're going to be a basket case. Because none of us are without sin, and none of us have the strength to keep going by ourselves. But God will make it happen. So in 13 to 20, he gives 3 facts about the faithfulness of God to encourage us. And the first one comes in verses 13 to 15, and it deals with the example of God's promises to Abraham. Verse 13, for when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. You heard what happened one day when God sneezed in heaven. Nobody knew what to say. God bless you. So when God swore, it's like, well, I don't know, if nobody else to swear by, I'll swear by myself. And he said, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply you. And so Abraham, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. So the idea here is that Abraham knew the trustworthiness and the faithfulness of God. The situation that it's talking about is going back to the statement here, I will surely bless you. That quotation actually comes from Genesis chapter 22. When Abraham was ready to offer up Isaac, God had already made the promise to give Abraham a great seed, a great family. And we first see that promise recorded in Genesis 12, and then God affirms it in chapter 15. In chapter 17 and 18, God came to Abraham and Sarah and said, okay, in 1 year I'm going to fulfill the promise, and Sarah is the one that's going to have this child. Now, if you go back before that, let's say when God told Abraham, I'm going to, make you into a great people and multiply your seed like the stars of the sky. None of those passages actually said, this is going to be only fulfilled through Sarah. Now, that would be the natural one to think about because that was his wife. But we know in Genesis 16, when she is like 75 years old, she says, you know what? I'm never going to have any kids, so let's have Hagar be a surrogate mother. And then 13 years after that, when Abraham is 99 and Sarah's 99, that's when God says, in 1 year, Sarah's going to have a child, and the promise is going to be fulfilled through that child. Now, that takes place when Abraham is 100, and then probably, we don't know exactly, but let's just throw a number out and say it was 12, 13 years later when Isaac was a teenager that God says, okay, now take Isaac and offer him up as a burnt offering. And, everything you read, that God says, okay. How long did it take to get from Beersheba, which means well of the oath? Beer is a well, Be'er. So well of the oath in Beersheba. How long does it take to walk from there to Jerusalem?
It's a few days, I don't know.
3 days.
Yeah.
So for 3 days, in Abraham's mind, my son's dead because I'm going to obey God. I believe him. And in all likelihood, God had indicated to Abraham that his promises would be fulfilled through resurrection. So in John chapter 8, verse 56, Jesus said to the unbelieving Jews who were wanting to kill him, he said, your father Abraham saw my day and he rejoiced in it. He's talking about the resurrection. So God had indicated to Abraham that there was going to be a resurrection as part of the fulfilling of God's promises. So Abraham believed God, and after he was willing to offer up Isaac, that's afterwards when the angel of the Lord stopped him. He says, okay, I see that you really trust me. I will surely bless you and surely multiply you. And that's the quotation right here. And so, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. Well, this is, meant to be an encouragement for all of us, that it's trusting in the faithfulness of God. That's what it's all about. Abraham knew he could trust God, and that's what Hebrews is doing, is saying, you need to keep trusting God. Verse 15 says, and so, having waited patiently, he obtained the promise. In verse 16, it brings us to a second fact about the faithfulness of God. It's the principle that stands behind this. For men swear by one greater than themselves, and with an oath is given as confirmation as an end of every dispute. So when you swear, you don't say, well, I swear by myself. Yeah, so what? That doesn't mean a thing to me, You swear by someone greater. And, this is basically the way it's supposed to work, is that when you swear something, that means, okay, this is absolutely certain. You get a bunch of kids playing, and one of them makes a claim, and the other one says, no way. And then the kid says something like, okay, I pinky swear, or some kind of stupid thing. An oath settles every dispute. That's what Hebrews says. Well, the point is, you can trust God. No matter what life may bring, you can trust him. Here's a third fact about God's faithfulness, verses 17 to 20. It's the application of all this to our own lives. Because Jesus has promised us eternal life based on his own redemption, we should persevere in our hope in God's promises. So in verse 17, in the same way, God, desiring even more to show the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, he interposed with an oath. Something you need to remember. God did not take an oath before Abraham because God was not trustworthy without it. The problem is not that God cannot be trusted. The problem is that you and I are liars, living in a world full of liars. And so the reason why God swore this promise to Abraham is this. It's like, we're weak and we need that kind of encouragement. So to help Abraham in his own human frailty, God swore an oath to Abraham, and that's what this is talking about right here. That he was going to fulfill these promises. Then comes the application of this in verses 18 to 20. So, he interposed with an oath to Abraham for this reason, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it's impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have is an anchor of the soul, a hope sure and steadfast, one that enters into the veil where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So, question here. He says, by two unchangeable things. What are those two unchangeable things? Not exactly clear. The text is not explicit, but I think this is what it is. One, it's the unchangeableness of God's purpose, and two, it's the impossibility for God to lie. Now, if you go through, different commentaries, you might see some variation on what those two unchangeable things are, but I think there's good reason for taking that based upon what the verse says. Here's the significance. We who have taken refuge in Christ have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope before us. 4 facts about this hope are laid out in verses 19 to 20. The first one is this. This hope is an anchor of the soul. That's what settles us. It's a hope that is sure and steadfast, undisturbed by any outside influence, steadfast, firm, secure. The point is this, it's the absolute security of your soul in the hands of Christ. And he says that this is something that we have fled to for refuge. We who have taken refuge, The Greek word here, to flee for refuge, is the word fugo. That's an intensified word, katafugo. What English word do we get out of fugo? A fugitive. A fugitive.
Can you explain a little bit more about the word hope? Because I have many people say, well, your hope is just wishful thinking and,
That's not what the Bible says, though.
I know, but hope can be, as you said up there, I forgot what you said, some sort of a
Anchor for the soul?
anchor, like an expectation that you, it's still a, I don't know.
Well,
It's like a noun and a verb.
Yeah,
I don't know.
in the biblical sense, hope is an absolutely certain expectation of what God is going to do in the future. So that's a good definition of it.
Yeah.
So in Romans 5, Paul says, we have this hope. Now, the question is, will that hope ever fail us? So going back to Romans 5, and the reason why Paul is making this discussion in Romans 5, and he says that is because Paul has a message in Romans, and the whole Bible has this message, that your eternal salvation is simply by trusting Christ. For a religious person who's spent their whole life thinking, I have to be good, I have to keep being good, it's like, you're saying just believe God and that's going to get the job done? I'm not sure that's really going to get the job done. So in chapter 5, he says, listen, we have been justified by faith, and because of that we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we've obtained this introduction by faith into his grace, where we stand in this grace. And we rejoice, verse 2, we exult, we rejoice, we brag about the hope of the glory of God. So, yeah, I brag about, what's going to happen. Christ is going to come. He's going to bring me into resurrection. He's going to judge this world. This is an absolutely certain hope. And he says, persevering in faithfulness produces in greater hope, okay? You see that in verse 4? Persevering produces character, and proven character produces hope. Will that hope ever fail us, Steve?
Not if you trust the Lord.
Yeah,
You
will never
trust in
fail us.
His-
Now, I think last week I
promises.
told this to the class, that I had this one guy, Volodya Narganuk, since 1999, an antagonistic Arminian. Now, we're friends, you know. If we saw each other right now, we'd give a big hug, you know. But he won't let go of his Arminianism, his Ukrainian Baptist Arminianism. So I was doing a chapel about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. And, probably like 150 people in the chapel over there. And I said, I was going through Romans 5, and I said, will this hope ever fail us? And he said, yes. I said, no. He said, yes. And I said, no, what does it say in the next verse? Hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. He kind of like dropped his head. Later on, he says, I'm sorry.
It's, okay. And when I talk to people like that, I say, well, there's a difference between just believing and trusting. You know, if you just believe in God, even the demons believe that. But if you trust, if you have totally trust, you put everything into it, all you have, that's where your hope comes from. But if you're just like, well, I think God exists and all this and that.
Well, we want people,
the
yeah.
hope is kind of tenuous. I
Well,
think,
for
right?
sure, we want people to understand the difference between just, empty, empty kinds of acknowledgement to trust. And so I think we should give people a strong assurance that genuine faith will give them eternal security.
Yeah.
But we don't want to have that connected to their mere profession. But if it's a genuine trust in Christ, and because that's how God saves, and there is such a thing as an empty faith. But he says a genuine hope in Christ is an anchor for the soul that's sure, steadfast. And when he says it enters into the veil, that's talking about the fact that Christ went into the presence of God to save us. Going back to this verse 18, though, it says that we who have taken refuge in him. So we have a word here, katafugo. So the implication here, do you know how I get rid of this thing? I don't like having this thing.
Don't ask me. That's for a 14-year-old.
Doc, what's it, when it says doc, what does that mean?
I don't know.
It's a Google,
It's a new AI feature.
AI thing, I think.
Try doc, see what happens.
There you go.
I don't
Kind
know.
of.
So this idea of fleeing for refuge, the linguistic kind of context here is that of the cities of refuge in the Old Testament. There is a word, intertextual connection here. So in the city of refuge, of course, if you, committed some kind of a crime, like, you accidentally killed somebody, you could go to the city of refuge, the nearest one. There were 6 of them, and then they would hold a trial. And when they hold a trial, they find out, okay, this guy didn't actually murder him. Now, if it was murder, it's like we're gonna put you to death. Okay, no options. We really need to do that in our country. But if it was, let's say, an accidental death, you go to the city of refuge, and they say, okay, this was not premeditated murder. The family of the murdered person could still come after you and take revenge and kill you. But if you stayed in the city of refuge, they were not allowed to come after you. And how long did you stay in the city of refuge? Forever. Until the death of the high priest. And when the high priest dies, your guilt is considered taken away. You can go back home and nobody can touch you again because your guilt has been removed. Huh? Does that sound familiar? Yeah, Christ is our city of refuge. And so that language and this imagery is going back to this. And here's the question. Have you fled to Jesus for refuge? In the eyes of God, all of us are criminals who need refuge. And if you have fled to the city of refuge, you can find the hope that you need. And he describes this hope, the hope where Jesus enters in within the veil. So that's Christ going through the curtain, so to speak, of the Holy of Holies, entering into the presence of God, because that's what Jesus did on the cross. He went into the presence of God. He went behind the curtain, just like a high priest would go behind the curtain on the Day of Atonement. So Jesus went into the presence of God as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Thoughts or questions so far? And he became a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. What in the world does this mean? Well, he's going to talk all about it here in chapter 7. Again, kind of thoughts or questions?
Well, Melchizedek was, I'm sure you get into it. He was not just king, but he was also a priest.
Yeah, so he's brought up Melchizedek a couple times. And now back in chapter 5, he says, I'd really like to talk about Melchizedek, but you guys are really, you're going backwards in your spiritual life. And I'd like to say more about Melchizedek, but you're not able to handle it. Well, now he's going to go back to it. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings, and he blessed him, to whom also Abraham apportioned a 10th part of the spoils, was first of all, by translation of his name, the king of righteousness, and then also the king of Salem, which is the king of peace. All right, so we know that Melchizedek comes on the scene. Where at in the Bible? Genesis 14. So what happened is that some Mesopotamian kings raided Sodom, and Abraham's nephew Lot and his family were down there in Sodom. So guess what? They took Lot and his family to become slaves. Yes, white people making slaves of other white people. Slavery has been around, but they took Lot, and so when Abraham got the message that Lot had been taken as a slave, Abraham rounded up 318 men from his company and made a midnight raid and was able to beat these guys and take back Lot and all the slaves and a whole bunch of possessions. And when he's coming back, he came to a town called Salem. What town is that? Jerusalem. Yeru is a Sumerian word that means city, so Jerusalem, city of peace. And so Melchizedek is the king of Jerusalem. Now, who was Melchizedek? Well, okay, we'll say this. He was the king of Jerusalem. But he also was a priest of El Elyon. In Hebrew, it means the Most High God. He's a priest of the living God. He's a believer, and he mediates for his people as a priest to God. Now, remember, Abraham is not even, at this point, Abraham is just, some wandering, guy that God has spoken to him and made promises. But Abraham is coming back, This is after he slaughtered these kings. And it says that Melchizedek blessed him. And Melchizedek and Abraham gave him a tenth of all the spoils of the victory. Now, as far as we know, I mean, Abraham had no particular relationship with, Melchizedek. There's one of the movies that I have, I think it's probably the Abraham one, where, it dramatizes it. And, Abraham says, "You know him? Oh, yeah. And you believe in him? Oh, yeah." It's
That's a good movie.
yeah.
I mean, I watched that movie as I'm going through Genesis. It's really good.
Yeah, and it really kind of just dramatizes something along the line of what it must have been like,
Yep.
So Abraham gave him a tenth of the very best, Now, it says here that Melchizedek was the king of righteousness. Why is that? Well, because Melech means king and Tzedek means righteousness. So Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. But also, he's the king of Salem, the word shalom, that basically means peace. So guess what? He's the king of righteousness and the king of peace. It says here, he's without father and without mother. What does that mean? What it means is this. It doesn't mean that he's some kind of eternal being. It doesn't mean he's Christ. It means that in the canonical message that we have in Genesis, it doesn't say anything about his family line. Now, if you were a Jew, and Jews didn't even exist yet, but later on when you talk about the formation of the nation to come to God, especially at Mount Sinai, when he made the covenant with the 2 million members of Israel, what family became the family of the priesthood?
Levi.
Mm-hmm.
Levites.
Yeah, so the tribe of Levi
Aaron's.
and the family of Aaron. So you had to come from the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron to be a priest. So if you were going to be a priest, you had to be able to document and say, well, here's my genealogy, But Melchizedek's a priest of the Most High God, but doesn't say anything about his genealogy. So when it says without father and without mother, this is saying we don't know anything about his family. But his priesthood doesn't hinge upon his family line, his bloodline. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Does that mean that he is eternal God? Now, some people, try to say that Melchizedek was the pre-incarnate Christ. No, he wasn't. But what does Genesis tell us about his birth or his death? Neither. So, he had no beginning, has no end, never tells us about him born, never tells us about him dying. But what happens is that by the Holy Spirit of Christ, the book of Hebrews, the prophet of the book of Hebrews, is bringing out and saying, well, guess what? He's like the Son of God. Because Christ has no beginning. He's eternal. His personhood is eternal. Now, he had a beginning as a human being, but Christ is eternal. And he never dies. He lives forever. And the book of Hebrews is saying, well, Melchizedek, by the work of the Spirit here in Hebrews, is saying Melchizedek is like a priest of God forever. You guys follow what's going on here? Now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch, here's the father of all Jews, and Abraham the patriarch gave him a tenth of the choicest spoils. This Melchizedek's got to be somebody pretty special. Now, if you think about Melchizedek and Abraham, that would date back to roughly something like, 2100 BC round numbers, okay? What year did Israel come out of Egypt? 1446 BC. So, that's like, 600 years later, 600 years later. And then after they came out, you now have, all the 12 tribes, 2 million people. And that's where God says, okay, the Levites are going to be my priestly family, and the priest is going to come from the family of Aaron. So all of the priests will come from the family of Aaron. The Levites were servants of God in worship at a broader level, but the family of Aaron was the priestly family. Where was the inheritance that God gave to the Levites?
And the temples?
Yeah, they didn't get an inheritance. They didn't get big ranches. They didn't, because the other tribes all got huge land inheritances where you could live. You could have your farms, your olives, your grapes, and everything else. The Levites didn't get. Now they did have an inheritance that surrounded the city, basically, places to live, but they didn't have, big ranch inheritances like the other tribes. So how are they going to survive? They receive a tithe from all the other tribes, and that tithe comes to the Levites, and then the tithe, flows down to the priests. So he says, the sons of Levi who receive the priest's office have a commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is, from their brethren. So all the other tribes are brothers, and they receive a tithe from all these other tribes, although they're all descended from Abraham. So they're all from Abraham, but the Levites get a tithe, and the priesthood gets a tithe from that. But the one whose genealogy is not traced from them, namely Melchizedek, collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed the one who had the promises. So here's a guy that's not even a Jew, a descendant of Abraham, receiving a tithe from Abraham, great-great-grandfather, because Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, grandson, Levi, great-grandson. So great-grandson Levi gets a tithe from the other tribes, and yet great-grandfather Abraham gave a tithe. This Melchizedek is something special. Verse 7, and without dispute, the lesser is blessed by the greater. It was Melchizedek that blessed Abraham. He's greater than Abraham. And in this case here, mortal men, meaning the Levites, they received tithes. But in the case of Melchizedek, one receives them, of whom it's witnessed he lives on. He lives forever. Again, it goes back to this concept that we don't see anything about his life or death. And so there, by the Spirit of God, is showing a typological foreshadowing of Christ. So to speak, verse 9, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, Levi, the Levites, the priests, were paying tithes because they're the great-grandson of Abraham. For Levi was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. This doesn't mean that Levi was actually paying a tithe, but it's making the connection that the descendant, the great-grandson of Abraham, figuratively speaking, was paying a tithe because Abraham was paying that tithe. You guys with me on all this? Questions or thoughts? And if you look at some of these things, you say, man, how did that guy come up with all this stuff? This is really amazing, Well, it's because he's writing by the inspiration of the Spirit of Christ. But these things are also coming out of the Old Testament passages themselves, because remember what Psalm 110 says, right? So here's a psalm by King David, 1,000 years before Christ, 1,000 years after Abraham, but 1,000 years before Christ. So in Psalm 110, the Lord, Yahweh, said to my Lord. So here's David. I heard Yahweh speak to my Lord, Christ. And what Yahweh said to David's Lord, Christ, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Sitting at the right hand of God doesn't say, oh, you're in the kingdom and you've begun to reign. It says, wait here until the day comes when I make your enemies your footstool in your kingdom. When that day comes, he says, Yahweh will stretch forth your strong scepter from Zion, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. This is when the kingdom comes, is when God says, I'm done with you guys, the world. And he brings his execution of judgment on a Christ-hating world. When that day comes, it says, your people will, it says volunteer freely, but it says kind of, your people will be free will offerings. A free will offering is where in the Old Testament you just said, I just want to give to God, you know. He says that's what your people are going to be. Complete submission, loving, thankful obedience in the kingdom. And when it describes them, and it says, in holy array from the womb of the dawn, your youth are like the dew. This could be speaking here about the resurrected saints that are going to be there in the kingdom. The beautiful resurrected saints that will be serving him in the kingdom. Or it could simply be talking about the believers that have now come into the righteousness of Christ and are in the kingdom. But one thing that is clear is that he says, your people are going to be beautiful in the kingdom. Then you come down to verse 4 and he says, Yahweh, the Lord has sworn and will never change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So, you know, the book of Hebrews isn't simply just, you know, making these things up out of nowhere. David, by the Spirit, says the Messiah is going to be a king priest. Because in verses 1, 2, and 3, you know, it says that you're the king who's going to rule from Jerusalem. But here it says that he's a priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, a king priest. The Lord, Adonai, this is Christ, O God, is at your right hand. He'll shatter kings in the days of his wrath. Yeah, all right, let's just pull up news. Yeah, let's just see what news says. Yeah, Mark Hamill, nice guy. Moron. Prosecutor seeks death penalty after hammer killing of store clerk. Did you see that one where that guy, like a few weeks ago? Out of nowhere, you know, somebody's just walking. The guy just comes up with a hammer. Smash, and it's all caught on the camera, you know, bashing this guy's head in. All right, so I say that because he's going to come and he's going to shatter kings in the days of his wrath. He'll judge among the nations. He'll fill them with corpses. He'll shatter the chief men over a broad country. This idea of chief men, that's actually the word, it's the word Rosh. He'll shatter the head. Very, very possibly, you know, pulling off of Genesis 3, he's going to crush the head. But he's going to have victory. He'll drink from the brook and he will lift up his head. This is the idea of victory. So this is God's king priest, okay? And what's happening here in verse 11 to 22, we see that the work of Jesus Christ testifies that there is a priesthood greater than the Old Testament Aaronic priesthood. And the reason why is because there was one eternal sacrifice that never had to be repeated again. So what was happening? What was the contextual background of what was starting to happen in the book of Hebrews, he was afraid that there were some people who actually had not come to faith because they were starting to walk away because of the hardship and the persecution. And he says, don't do that. Because what they were going to do is they were just going to go back, well, I'm just going to go back to the law, go back to the old covenant, go back to, the synagogue and the temple, go back to the priesthood, Aaronic priesthood. And he says, there's something better. Now, if perfection, and that's kind of that word teleosis, okay? There's several of these words that occur in the book of Hebrews. This noun, teleosis, perfection or wholeness or completion, this is, repeated with different variations of the same word. If complete wholeness came through the Levitical priesthood, on the basis of Leviticus priesthood, the people received the law. So if you basically had everything you needed, spiritually speaking, through the Old Testament Aaronic Levitical priesthood, well, what further need was there for another priest to rise up according to the order of Melchizedek and not be designated according to the order of Aaron? Now remember, we just looked at Psalm 110 where it says there is going to be another priest come, but his priesthood is according to the order of Melchizedek. So what the book of Hebrews says right here is that, listen, if everything we needed was simply through the Aaronic Levitical priesthood, why did God talk about another priesthood? Here in verse 11 to 22, the Word of God shows us 5 needs related to perfect redemption that God brought us through Jesus Christ. There was a need for a new priest, a need for a new law, a need for a new tribe, a need for a new hope based on a new covenant, and the need for a new security based on better promises. So it starts off here in verse 11, the need for a new priest. Well, we know there's a need for a new priest because, like we just said, the Old Testament said there was going to be another priest, and that is Psalm 110. That's the details, huh? Verse 12, here's a second need. The promise of a new priest testifies the need for a new order and a new bringing in of a new law. So for when the priesthood is changed, of necessity, there takes place a change of the law also. What the writer does here is he makes it clear that if there's a change in the priesthood, that means there's going to be a change in the law. They're intimately connected. Why was there a need for this? 3 reasons. 1, the law of Moses was only a shadow that pointed ahead, we see in chapter 8. 2, the law of Moses was not the end product, but it pointed ahead to something greater. And 3, in and of itself, the law never dealt with sin in the final sense. I use an example. It's like buying a new TV with a credit card. You buy the TV, you pay for it on a credit card, and then you do the same thing next day. You buy a new stereo. Well, then comes the day of reckoning when you get your bill. I have had so many horrible experiences with credit cards over my life. As soon as I get a balance, I call and I pay it off. It just bugs me so bad. So here's the immediate point on chapter 7, verse 12. With the coming of a new priest, that means there's going to be an end of the law of Moses. Now, none of that should have been a surprise to anybody because God already said there was going to be a change takes place. When there's a change in priesthood, there's a change in the law as well. So we think about Jeremiah chapter 31, where God says, okay, you guys really blew it. Now you're taken away by Babylonian exile. So you broke the covenant, Israel. Behold, the days are coming when I will make a new covenant. With whom? House of Israel, house of Judah. But you're never going to break it again like you did. It's not going to be like the covenant that I made with you at Mount Sinai when I brought you out of Egypt. Although I was faithful to you, you're not going to break the covenant again. But this is the covenant that I will make with them. I'm going to save them. And I'm going to put my law within them. I'm going to write it on their hearts. I'll be their God. They'll be my people. And when I bring them to me, they're all going to know me. Each one will know me. And they're not going to have to be evangelizing one another, say, well, you need to know the Lord, because I'm going to save all of them. So the old covenant is gone forever. And really, the final, if you want to, the final end of the old covenant, it was the death of Christ himself. Because it says in Hebrews chapter 2, not Hebrews, but Ephesians 2, verses 14 and 15, that when Christ died on the cross, he abolished the law and all the commandments that were part of that law. Law is gone forever. Hey, wait, that's wrong. I said Isaiah 51:1. On that note, that's Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1. Sorry. My notes aren't infallible. So anyhow, the old covenant, it's dead. Now, you got a whole bunch of ignorant Jews that still think, oh no, God's really pleased with us because we obey his law. Well, they weren't obeying the law 2,000 years ago. They weren't obeying it 2,600 years ago, and that's why he sent them into exile. They weren't obeying it 2,000 years ago when they killed the mediator who gave them the law. By the way, who was it that gave them the law? Who was the mediator of that covenant? Well, Moses was the mediator, but in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 2, it says, in that burning bush, it says that was the messenger of the covenant. The Malach Yahweh, the messenger of the covenant. He was the angel of Yahweh. So that was Christ establishing a covenant with his people. But in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 15, it says Christ abolished the enmity, which is the law of commandments with all of its ordinances, so that in himself he would make the two, Jews and Gentiles, into one new man. When God brings people to faith in Christ and saves them in Christ, we're not becoming Jews. We're not becoming part of Israel. Jews and Gentiles are becoming one in the body of Christ. So the point is this: the old covenant is gone forever. He says this in 7:12, 7:18, 8:13, 10:9. And he goes on to say, when we come back here to, what verse are we on? Chapter 7 what? 12? Sorry. Takes place a change of law. All right, look at my notes here. The new covenant has been inaugurated by the death of the Messiah.
Just leave it the way it is.
What's that?
Just leave it there.
Tommy and I have discussions about this point here. So, the new covenant has been inaugurated. All right, now, if we say inaugurated, I don't know, what does the word inaugurated mean?
Begins.
It's begun? Yeah, you're right. I mean, it just, what does inaugurated mean? To induct, okay, into an office, to make a formal beginning, commence, begin, and so on. So in my notes from 12 years ago, I make the comment here, the new covenant has been inaugurated by the death of the Messiah. I would take exception with my own words right here, okay? I don't believe that that is a precise way of explaining what has happened so far. And I'll explain what I mean. But here's what I can say. His death has made the restoration of Israel possible under a new covenant. But that restoration of it, so what I would say is this, the new covenant restoration by the death of Messiah, a death has been provided for that restoration of Israel under a new covenant. I'm being really picky on my words right here. The restoration of Israel under the new covenant cannot take place until Israel repents of its sins and embraces Jesus Christ as the Son of God. So the covenant, I don't think we should say, has been inaugurated. A death has taken place for a restoration of Israel under the covenant. Okay? Now, if we say here, what is the church's relation to the new covenant? Now, what do I say here? Through faith in the one Son of God, the church shares in the salvific blessings that Christ offers through his death on the cross. Do I like what I said right here?
You know, that's what MacArthur says too.
Yeah, I like what I said right here. I don't like the new covenant has been inaugurated. I don't think it has. But through faith in that one Son of God, the church shares in the salvific blessings that Christ offers through his death on the cross.
Well, that's what most people mean when they say the new covenant's been inaugurated.
Yeah, but that's an inaccurate statement. Here, this actually came, it was just some, I don't know, some Facebook website that, you know, I've got a connection to. So this came in that website today, and I just printed off and put it in an email, and I emailed it to both me, well, to me, and I made a copy. Now, on this thing here, proposal number 2, and what this little deal did is it said, what are the different views on the new covenant and the new covenant in the relationship to the church? And it says there are 4 main kind of views on this idea that you'll find within dispensational circles. View number 1, which nobody believes anymore, and it was never very big, but they said, well, there's 2 new covenants. There's a new covenant for Israel, and there's a new covenant for the church. And that was an attempt by a few authors to try to say, here's how we should understand that. The second proposal right here is this. The new covenant is exclusively with the nation of Israel, which I think is the best way of explaining and understanding this. The third way of understanding it, it says the church has indirect participation with new covenant blessings. And then the fourth view is this, progressive revelation and Gentile inclusion, that basically says that there's kind of like more of a direct sharing in the blessings of the new covenant. Now, if you go back here to this second idea that the new covenant is exclusively God's restoration of a nation, it says here, when you look at all of the promises of the Old Testament, this view is unquestionable. I mean, I'm going to make a new covenant with Israel and restore them. While the New Testament appears to associate the church with the new covenant in a few passages, like for example, Jesus in Luke chapter 22 when he was doing the, Last Supper, which was a Passover celebration, he said, "This is the new covenant in my blood." So you look at that.
Poured
and
out for many.
what's that?
Poured out for many.
Yeah. So this is the new covenant in my blood. So my death is going to be the basis for the new covenant, okay? My blood, my death. And so because people read that in Luke 22 and the Gospels, they say, well, right here, it says that this is, Christ's death is providing for the new covenant, and we do communion every month, so this must be something for the church. I don't believe that's an accurate statement based on what you have happening. When he was there with his disciples, they're expecting him to bring in the kingdom imminently. They didn't even, think he was going to get crucified, even though he told them. But they're expecting him to crush the Romans at any moment and bring the kingdom. And that's why they were all saying, "Hosanna, Son of David, come and save us." So any of the statements, when you look at the statements that talk about new covenant in Luke 22 or in 2 Corinthians chapters 3 and 4, or in Hebrews chapters 7 to 10, they are all looking prospectively at the promise of the kingdom that Christ is going to bring. But they thought it was happening like any moment. They expected it.
But Dr. Dane,
Yeah.
you and I are ministers of the new covenant.
Well, just go back to what I just said. What their historical setting, okay? So when Paul says that in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, what is happening in Corinth is that false teachers, Judaizers, are dragging the church back and saying, no, you guys, you all have to become Jewish converts if you're a Gentile, and you must submit to the law of Moses. They were trying to drag the church under the old covenant, which is dead to begin with. But if you're putting your confidence in being a Jew, or if you have your confidence in being right with God because of your obedience to the law, Paul says that's death. We're not ministers of a dead religious legalism. We're ministers of the promises of restoration, of a new covenant. The statement in its context is prospectively looking at salvation to enter the kingdom. I think that, so what this is saying right here is this.
Well, what's interesting is I didn't explain any of it. All I did was say the words.
Well, I'm interacting with you. But if you look at any of the comments, so what it says here, it says, when you look at some of the verses that do speak about the new covenant, because in fact, the New Testament does have, about a half dozen places where it talks about the new covenant. And it says the appearance of potentially speaking about the church being a part of the new covenant is because the church is united to Jesus Christ, who also is the mediator of the new covenant for Israel. The benefits the church enjoys resemble those of the new covenant because they flow from the same sacrifice, but they're not identical. The church has no relationship whatsoever with the new covenant or its proper blessings.
Then why would Paul use that language? Like, what?
Okay, I've said it a couple times, but I'm going to say it again. It's because there is a polemical issue going on where false teachers are saying, come back to the old covenant. And he's saying, that's dead. And if you put your confidence in, trying to get right with God by, going back to the Torah, it's dead. We're not ministers of the old covenant. We're ministers of the new covenant. And in fact, in the historical setting, it's looking at this imminent anticipation of Christ to come and return and bring the kingdom. So for Israel, that's exactly, for the nation, that's exactly what their hope is. Salvation and participation in the kingdom to be restored to God under the new covenant.
I was asking for their benefit, not just mine.
Yeah. So without question, you have some statements in the New Testament that talk about use the new covenant statement, right? You know, option A is we say, oh, well, this is genuinely saying that it's something about the church, but option B on how you handle those is you go back to the historical context, and it's looking at this eager anticipation for Christ to bring the kingdom and bring Israel into that restoration under a new covenant in the kingdom. And that's what I've been exposed to. And I sent an article to everybody here just a couple hours ago. I think that is a better way of explaining why those statements come. And, you know, I'm not alone in that. Because as you can see, I've had a shifting on that, you know, point, you know, myself.
I miss your old self.
I think I'm better. Yeah. And because you have to go back and say, what is the new covenant? What is it? What's the old covenant? If there's a new covenant, you know, what's the old covenant?
You're saved by obeying the law.
I wouldn't say that at all. You were never saved by obeying the law. You were saved
Well, I know, but.
always
but
by
you were
grace through
required
faith.
To follow the law.
Yeah, Israel was commanded
You
to
were
follow.
saved by faith, I know, but you were required to follow the law.
Yeah, so Israel, the nation, but where did the law come from? Where did the law come from?
God.
Okay, when did Israel come into a relationship with the law?
At Mount Sinai.
At Mount Sinai. That is when God made a covenant.
Isn't that the whole point of, or the argument of Hebrews, is that like the promise, like in other words, the old covenant was established on lesser promises, and the new covenant is established on greater promises given to the Son through the order of Melchizedek, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it does just like everything else. And so this is what's happening in 4:14 to 10:18. It says Christ's priesthood and his sacrifice and his priestly ministry is greater than the old covenant. But when God, brought Israel to himself at Mount Sinai, this is when he brought them into a covenant relationship. In Exodus chapter 24, in verse 7, he took the book of the covenant at Mount Sinai, Moses did. He read it in the hearing of the people, and all the people said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. We will be obedient. He read the covenant, which is the Torah, the Ten Commandments, and everything that followed as part of the law. He read it to them, and they said, we will be faithful to the covenant. And so Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance to all these words. The covenant was not established. It was not inaugurated until the people said, we'll do that. They had to swear submission to the covenant. Until they swear submission to the covenant, they're not under the covenant. When they swore submission to be obedient to God, that's when he inaugurated it. The inauguration of the covenant came when he sprinkled the blood. So the death had already taken place of this animal, and he had the blood, but when they swore submission, that's when he inaugurated and ratified the covenant. Because they were not even under the covenant until they said, we'll submit.
So I'm curious about this correlation. Well, what does it mean? I know slightly ahead, but it's still relevant. 8:6, where he says he mediates a better one since it's enacted on better promises.
Well, it is.
So, like, what does he mean by that?
Well, let's wait and get to that. We'll get to
Okay,
that.
what are these promises?
You mean like in Exodus 24?
Yeah.
Well, God says, I am your God. I am going to bless you. And, I'm going to favor you more than any other nation in the whole world. But you have to stay faithful to me. Okay? Now, did Israel stay faithful? No. what Jeremiah 31 says, when I bring you guys to myself under a new covenant, I'm going to save you all. I'm going to bring regeneration, and my grace is going to assure that you are never, ever, ever going to walk away, because I swear that my grace is going to keep you faithful to me. That's the promise. A regenerated nation, and the promise that his grace will never let them fall away again. What percentage of the people were saved here in Exodus 24? I don't know. My guess is 5 or 10%.
Didn't Paul say a remnant?
Well, he doesn't say specifically about what percentage of people were saved right here, but it does say that he was not pleased with most of them. It says that in the Bible. So you had a nation of people that have been saved miraculously by God from Egypt, but most of them were not saved, and that's why when they came to the edge of the promised land, which comes right after this, they said, well, we can't do this.
Would you agree that there is always a remnant
Yeah.
in every generation that he saved?
Yes, but what he says that it's going to happen in the kingdom, when he brings the nation into a restored relationship under a new covenant, he says every one of them is going to be saved.
What about the Zechariah prophecy saying only a third of them will repent?
Yeah, every single one of them is going to be saved when they enter the kingdom. 2/3 are going to die in disbelief and not be in the kingdom. 1/3 he's going to save. So in Jeremiah 31:34 that we looked at a moment ago, he says, every one of them is going to know me. So they're not going to be saying, hey, you need to know the Lord. He says they're all going to know me. And so what God promises is that my grace is going to save you, and you're never, ever, ever going to fall away. So those are the better promises. It's a regenerate nation with the assurance that they're never going to fall away in apostasy again.
So should
That's what's going to happen with Israel when he restores them in the new covenant.
Can you flesh out antinomianism?
Well, it really kind of like is not part of the discussion
Okay.
here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to blow you off, but
No, that's
I don't
fine.
think that's really not, yeah.
I know that word comes up, and I didn't know if it somehow tied in with it, so that's fine.
This was actually something I saw in reading one of Kaiser's books. The promise or the covenant is made to the Son, and the old covenant is made with Moses, who's a finite being. One is given to the Son, one is given to the people.
No, I don't think that's an accurate recollection of what he said, but it may have been, he may have said that. But the promise here is made to the nation, where he says, if you guys will stay faithful, I'll bless you, okay?
So, it's like Psalm 110, when he says, I'm going to make you a priest after the order of Melchizedek. That's the Father talking to the Son.
That is right there. Mm-hmm.
That's a promise,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's one of the promises.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, these promises that Israel is going to inherit, these are promised. So some of them were given to the. So what he said, some of them were given directly to the house of Israel, and then others were given directly to the Son. But since they're both, they're both in each other, it's kind of the same thing.
Well, Moses was the one that mediated the covenant. Christ is the mediator of the new covenant. But here, so look at this right here in Jeremiah 31. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel.
Yeah.
So it's a covenant with Israel. I will put my law in them. I'll put my heart in them. I'm going to save them. I'm going to be their God. They'll be my people. And so they will all know me from the least to the greatest, because I'm going to give them forgiveness. So this is a promise of a restoration for the nation, but he says, you're never going to break it again, because my grace is going to assure that you never break it.
I don't think we're disagreeing on anything. What I'm trying to
Mm-hmm.
flesh out in a bigger picture is that promise is based on the fact that the other promises are given to the Son. In other words, today you are my Son, I have begotten you. You're going to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. These are promises built on promises that fulfill what you're talking about. But they were given to the Son of God for him to fulfill that to Israel.
Well, so what God, and this is Christ speaking to them right here. He says, I'm going to save you, and my grace is going to assure that you never walk away again in apostasy. So it's the grace of God that comes to them by Christ that brings them that eternal security.
But do you see what I was highlighting at? The promises given to the Son are greater than the promises that were given to Moses through the Mosaic covenant.
Well, yeah, but you're ignoring that he's.
I'm ignoring it because.
But you're ignoring that he's making promises to the nation.
Well,
we can't.
I'm suggesting it's both.
Well, so he tells the Son, "You are my eternal, priest." Okay, and what it says here is that because of God's grace that saves them, and the same grace that saves Israel in the future is the same grace that saves you and me.
That's exactly why these are greater promises. In other words, that is contingent on not a Mosaic priesthood, but on the Son of God himself doing things that have never been done before.
Well,
that promise is fulfilled and given to Israel on a greater foundation.
Well, because of salvation, it's based upon a redemption. The law of Moses was these promises that he made to them. I'll bless you, are not because Moses didn't say God's going to bless our nation because we are all recipients of redeeming grace. They weren't all recipients of redeeming grace. Most of them were not saved. But he swore these promises to the nation if they would stay faithful, and so they didn't stay faithful. But when he brings Israel into a restored relationship in the kingdom, he says, you're never ever going to apostatize again because my grace assures it. And it's Christ is the one who is giving that grace to his people. But the promise is sworn to Israel. So we can look at, the promises like, you're an eternal priest. Yeah, God swore that this is what Christ is going to do. But this promise that he gives to the nation is this. I'm going to save you and you're never going to blow it again. So let's keep going here. Hebrews, what verse did we get down to? Chapter 7, verse 12. So here's the comments here. The church's relationship to the new covenant through faith in the Son of God, the church shares absolutely, this is it, in the salvific blessings that Christ offers through his death on the cross. That's definitely the thing that we share in. And that doesn't mean, we're part of the new covenant. But we have the salvific blessings.
So, just real quick, Dr. Day.
Sure.
My arguments, you're not taking them as I'm advocating for some different new covenant views. I'm not even putting that in. That's new covenant given to Israel, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that all the arguments of Hebrews is that promise right there is greater than the Mosaic covenant because it's given to the Son. He goes, he fulfills it, and he gives it to Israel.
Well, I basically agreed with that already.
What about do you agree with the fact that the greater promises are given to the Son? He fulfills them, and that's the greater foundation, and he gives it to Israel. Well,
I think if I'm hearing what you're saying and I'm following, but I've said, this redemption that Christ is going to bring to Israel in the future, and the promise of never falling away is because of his grace through Christ to his people Israel.
Okay.
So that's a much greater promise than, I'm giving you the land of Canaan right now. I fulfilled my promise and stay faithful. But if you don't stay faithful, here's what's going to happen. And they did apostatize. Verses 13 to 17, here's a third need. Related to this idea of a new priest and a new law, you also had the reality that there was a need for a new tribe. So for the one concerning whom these things are spoken, namely Christ, belongs to another tribe from which no one has officiated at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord descended from Judah. It's kind of interesting here that The word descended is actually sprang from, anatello, sprang from Judah, a tribe with reference to which Moses spoke nothing about priests. So he's saying, you know what? Old Testament, Levites. Okay? That's the tribe. Christ, he's from Judah. And this is clearer still if another priest arises according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become such, not on the basis of a law of physical requirement. In other words, Melchizedek wasn't a priest because of some genealogy. Neither is the Messiah a priest because of genealogy. But Messiah becomes a priest according to the power of an indestructible life. For it is attested of him, you're a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So what he's going to say here is that there's going to be, the priest is going to come from a new tribe. He's not going to come from Levi. He's going to come from Judah, which in fact, Christ comes from Judah. Genesis 49 verse 10, way back, Jacob said, what did he say in 49:10?
About the scepter.
The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until the one comes to whom it belongs. And to him will be the obedience of all the peoples. So Judah is singled out as being the kingly tribe. Christ is from a different tribe. Verses 18 to 28 continue this explanation of grace. So we've had in verses 11 to 17 a new priest, a new law, a new tribe. Here in verses 18 to 19, a new hope based on a new covenant, a new basis, a new security, and a new sufficiency. Now, for these people, what nationality were these people?
Didn't we just talk about this? The Jews actually descended from
Judah,
the tribe of Judah.
And
Well-
then eventually those
Well,
the
the-
Israelites from the northern kingdom who went to the southern kingdom were adopted, and they were also considered Jews.
No, a Jew is a descendant from the 12 tribes.
Okay, so it's more
This-
broader than that.
It's
Yeah, a Jew is somebody that descends from the 12 tribes of Israel, not only from Judah.
because isn't the origin of the word Jews something Judah, or from the kingdom of Judah?
Yeah, but you're thinking about a statement in Romans 2. But a Jew, an Israelite, which is what a Jew is, an Israelite is a descendant from the 12 tribes. Judah, you could be from Judah, but not necessarily. But what's happening here? When I talk about this right here, I made the question: who is being spoken of in all of these things? What ethnic group? It's not a trick question.
You went past your notes, so I can't even.
Well, it's all about Israel. These are all Jews.
Mm.
So it's called the book of Hebrews.
Mm.
What you have right here is when it talks about this future that is going to come in the kingdom and what God is going to do. In context, these are speaking to the Jewish people to whom this letter is written. Coming back here, in verses 18 to 19, we have the first fact about the priesthood of Christ. It's a new hope based on a new covenant. So verse 18, for on the one hand, with the coming of Christ, who's a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, on the one hand, there's a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness. When he says a former commandment, what's he talking about?
Old covenant?
The old covenant. So there's a setting aside of the old covenant because of its weakness and uselessness. Now, was the old covenant bad? No. Read Paul in Romans 7. He says, the law is great. No problem with the law. The problem is us. We're sinners. So, and that's what he means when he says its weakness and its uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect. There's that expression, made perfect again. The law never brought spiritual wholeness. So the law has to be set aside. On the other hand, there's the bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. Better hope, so Tommy, this would be, really exactly all the things that you were articulating, that God makes these better promises. But the reason why these promises are better is because God says, my son is going to bring regeneration to all of you. He's going to restore you in eternal salvation. And he swears that he's never going to allow you to apostatize again. Wow, what a great promise. So that is the promise that is going to be realized when he brings that nation back to himself in a restored relationship, a new covenant. So there's a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. And inasmuch, he says here in verse 20, as it was not without an oath, for the Levitical priests in the Old Testament, they became priests, he says, without an oath. To become a priest in the Old Testament, you just had to be in the right family. But Christ, he became one with an oath, through whom it was said to him, the Lord has sworn and will never change his mind. You're a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So, by much more, Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. Well, okay, so it's doing some comparison here. Old Testament priest? Yeah, my dad, he's the high priest, and I'm the firstborn son, so I'm going to be the high priest. Not that I really care. I mean, I'd rather be out body surfing down in Caesarea, But, I'm the firstborn son, so not mocking, what you could have with an unbelieving son. So, but you became the priest because of bloodline. But God swore an eternal priesthood to Christ. So that's better. He's the guarantee of a better covenant. You guys follow the kind of like line of argument that he's doing? So here's facts about the priesthood of Christ. It's a new hope based upon a new covenant. It's about the priesthood of a new basis, which is God swore this priesthood to Christ the Son. Here's a third fact about it. It's a new security. The coming of our great priest testifies to a new security. The former priests, the Old Testament, on the other hand, they existed in greater number because they were prevented by death from continuing. Could you be a priest forever in the Old Testament? No, you're going to die. You can't be a mediator if you're dead. By the way, that's why you can't pray to Mary and you can't pray to dead saints. The capacity for interceding, praying for somebody, ends when you die. But Christ, on the other hand, because he continues forever, because he lives forever, he holds his priesthood permanently. So we need somebody to save us eternally. They've got to live forever. Therefore, verse 25, because he does live forever, he's able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Your capacity to intercede for somebody ends when you die. You can't pray for people when you're dead. And if you were a priest, let's say under the law of Moses, your capacity to intercede and be a mediator ends when you die. Not true with Jesus. Jesus said in John 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Nothing can take away his priesthood. God says, my son died once, but he's alive forevermore. And that's why he can give eternal salvation. He's able to save forever. Verses 26 to 28, here's a fourth fact about his priesthood, a new sufficiency. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those Old Testament priests, to offer up sacrifices over and over again, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. So there's a perfect sufficiency in the death of Christ. Who is this high priest? He says in verse 26, he's holy, completely pious. He's innocent. There's no iniquity. There's no sin. So the first word right there, holy, without fault, devout, pious, innocent, guileless, no sin, undefiled, a word that speaks about pure in a religious and moral and ceremonial sense. All of this is pointing to ceremonial cleanliness under the law. He is separated from sinners, so he has no connection with our sin, even though he became a man. And he's exalted above the heavens, meaning that in his resurrection, he's now been taken into the place of God as our mediator. And because of who he is, it says in verse 7, and the nature of his sacrifice, he doesn't need to offer up sacrifices daily. Well, that's the way it was in the Old Testament. Every evening, every morning, they had burnt offerings going. And every year you had to do the high sacrifice, the Day of Atonement. So that's the way it was. Perpetual sacrifices, which tells you these things are not the answer for our sin. If you got to keep doing sacrifices, the sin problem hasn't been dealt with in finality if you have to keep doing sacrifices. But you had to keep doing them under the Old Testament. But Jesus doesn't need to do that like those high priests, because he did this once for all when he offered up himself.
Speaking of sacrifices, how is modern Israel going around it? Because they're still following the old law, but they're not sacrificing anymore.
Yeah, they can't even do a sacrifice. So, you know, there are times on some Jews in the Day of Atonement, they'll take a chicken and they'll strangle it and swing it around. Pretty pathetic effort. But yeah, they don't have it. So it's like, you know, first of all, that old covenant, God said it's gone forever. But for these people who still think that,
they're still following it, except
well, they're
for the
not.
sacrifices.
They weren't following it, you know, 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, but they're not even following it because it's dead now.
Oh, yeah. But in their minds, they think they're still
yeah.
following it.
Yeah. So he summarizes it here with this final contrast. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, where he said, you are my priest forever. The word of the oath appoints, which came after the law, to David in Psalm 110, appoints a son who is made perfect forever. So all the law could do is give you a priest who came from a certain family line. Maybe he'd be a good guy, maybe not. Maybe he would be a true believer, maybe not. In either case, those priests offered up all these sacrifices day after day, year after year, but there's only one perfect mediator to God, and that's Christ. And this is what, you know, is happening right here, is he's saying, come on, you guys. And he's doing it by going back to the Old Testament itself, you know. He's saying, look, it says there's going to be something better, and that's who Jesus is, so don't walk away. Yeah. Well, I mean, we got started late today, which I'm not making a judgment. I'm just saying that that brings us to 9 o'clock now, which is kind of where we're going as a pattern, 6:30 to 9. Should we keep going or end?
9 o'clock's my bedtime. Well,
let me just see what this looks like. So that brings us to chapter 8.
You already covered 6 and 7 tonight.
8 to 10, 18. Got 13 chapters.
How many weeks do we have left?
Well, it's really gonna be better, I'd rather not keep going. I mean, we've made some pretty good, we've kept a pretty good pace. So, so this says here that, and we're doing a little extra time, but, there would be 1, 2, 3, 4. If we stretched it out to June 12th, there'd be 5 more classes. But that's to do chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 6 chapters? Yeah, so we're on a good schedule.
You could easily cover that in 4.
Yeah, well, even 3, I mean, maybe 3 or 4. So we might be done, let's say, by the end of this month, 5, 21, 5, 28. So 14, 21, 28.
I don't think we'll be here next week. Well, I'll be preoccupied with my daughter. She comes in a couple days early.
Okay, so so if that were the case, then I probably wouldn't even try to have class that night, of course. But
I
so
imagine she'll be running around doing wedding stuff.
so if we had class on the 21st, the 28th, and June 5th, final class.
Mhm.
What about? Oh wow! I didn't realize 1 week. Next time go by that fast.
All right, so that's good to know. Yeah. Anyhow,